The wind was already strong when I pulled into the gravel driveway that led to the cabin. The late afternoon sun was sinking behind the tall pines that surrounded the small clearing. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A quiet weekend away from the city noise. No one around for miles, just me and the woods. The cabin was old but solid, built decades ago by someone who knew how to work with the land and timber. It sat on the edge of a small lake, the water dark and still, reflecting the sky like glass. The air smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and something faintly metallic, like iron from deep underground. The first thing I noticed as I got out of the car was how heavy the silence was. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels peaceful. It was thick and pressing, like the forest itself was holding its breath. No birds, no rustling of small animals, nothing but the wind moving the tops of the trees. I pulled my pack off the back seat and locked the car behind me. The cabin door creaked as I opened it, the wood swollen from years of weather. Inside, the smell was even stronger, old wood, dust, and that strange faint iron smell, as if the walls themselves had soaked up something I couldn't see. The windows were grimy but let in enough light to see the simple furnishings. A wooden table, a few chairs, a rusty stove in the corner, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. I dropped my pack by the door and went outside to gather some firewood. The forest floor was damp and covered in a thick layer of pine needles and dead leaves. Every step I took made a soft crunching noise that seemed too loud in the stillness. I could hear the wind in the trees above, but still no birds or animals. I stacked the wood near the cabin and headed back inside. The sun was almost gone, leaving a pale orange glow behind the thick trees. I started a fire in the stove, the flames crackling and pushing back the cold that had settled inside. As the room warmed, I took out my map and compass, planning a hike for the next day. The forest around the cabin was marked as dense and wild, with no trails or clearings beyond this small clearing. As night fell, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the branches scrape against the cabin walls. The iron smell was stronger now, almost sharp in my nose. I sat close to the fire, feeling the warmth spread through my fingers, but the silence outside was so complete it felt unnatural. No animals, no insects, just the wind and the occasional creak of the old cabin. Around midnight, I heard it, something soft, but deliberate, coming from outside. A low scraping sound, like nails or claws against wood. My heart jumped, and I stayed very still, listening. It stopped after a few seconds, but then started again, this time on the other side of the cabin. The sound wasn't natural, not like any animal I knew. It was slow and careful, as if something was trying to get in without making too much noise. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and opened the door just a crack, shining the beam around the dark clearing. The light caught the rough bark of the trees, the water glistening in the distance, but nothing moved. The wind had died down, and the silence returned, heavier than before. I closed the door and locked it, checking the windows. All were shut tight, but the cabin felt suddenly fragile, like it could be broken through at any moment. I moved the heavy kitchen knife from the drawer and sat near the fire, listening. Every creak, every whisper of the wind made me jump. The scraping sounds never came back, but I knew something had been out there, watching. The next morning, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. I decided to explore the edge of the forest to try to understand what I was dealing with. As I stepped out, the cold air hit me, and I smelled the iron again, stronger than the night before. I looked down and noticed the ground near the cabin was stained dark in patches. At first, I thought it was just wet soil, but when I knelt closer, I realized it was blood. I traced the stains leading from the woods to the cabin's foundation. They were fresh, bright red in the dim morning light. Panic rose in me, but I forced myself to keep calm. Following the trail, I moved deeper into the forest, pushing aside branches and stepping over fallen logs. The blood stains were irregular, as if the source was dragged or stumbled. Then I found the first set of footprints, large, heavy, and not quite human. The toes were too long and curved, the prints too wide for any animal I knew in the area. The deeper I went, the thicker the trees became, and the iron smell stronger. I stopped when the trail ended abruptly near a small depression in the ground, like a pit. Inside, the earth was torn up, and the blood pooled in the bottom, dark and sticky. Nearby, broken branches and crushed leaves showed signs of a struggle. I backed away slowly, realizing the forest held something alive, dangerous, and wild. Something not just big, but smart enough to move quietly and stalk the cabin. I hurried back, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and piled furniture against the windows. I kept the fire roaring, its heat and light a small comfort against the dark. The wind was still, but the oppressive silence was worse. I stayed awake, clutching the knife, listening to every sound. At around 2 a.m., the scraping returned, louder and more urgent. This time it was on the back door, then the windows. Something was trying to get inside. I held my breath as heavy thuds hit the wood, the sound of claws scratching deep gouges into the cabin walls. The firelight flickered over shadows moving just beyond the glass. I remembered the footprints, the size, the shape. It wasn't a bear, not exactly. The creature was something else, something that used the forest and its darkness to hunt. I could hear it breathing outside, slow and heavy, and I felt the ground vibrate beneath my feet with every step it took. Suddenly, the back door gave a crack under the pressure. I pushed the chair harder, but it splintered. The door burst inward with a deafening crash. Cold night air and the smell of iron flooded the room. I backed up against the stove, knife raised, heart racing. 2 glowing eyes appeared in the doorway. The creature was massive, fur-matted and soaked in dark patches, muscles rippling under thick skin. Its jaws were wide, dripping with saliva and something darker. It growled low, the sound vibrating through my chest. I lunged with the knife, but it was fast. It swiped with one huge paw, knocking me off balance and sending me crashing into the table. The fire went out as the stove door swung open, plunging the room into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, knife ready, breathing ragged. The creature circled, sniffing the air. I grabbed a burning log from the hearth and swung it like a club. The flames caught the fur near its face, making it howl and back off a step. I threw the log to the floor, and the fire roared back to life. The creature snarled and retreated to the door, limping slightly, then vanished into the night. I didn't chase it. I knew I wasn't going to win. The silence came back, heavier and colder. The next morning, I didn't wait. I packed my things quickly, my hands still shaking from the night's terror. Outside, the sun was barely up, and the forest seemed calm again, as if nothing had happened. I left the cabin behind, driving away with my heart pounding. The bloodstains, the huge footprints, the creature, it was real and it was still out there. I didn't want to think about what it was, only that it had hunted me, tested me, and almost broken through my last line of defense. I never went back to that cabin, but every time I close my eyes, I still see those glowing eyes in the dark, and I hear the scraping on the wood, coming closer, always closer. The forest holds its secrets, and sometimes it lets something dangerous loose, something not meant to be disturbed. The night I spent alone in that cabin is something I will never forget. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just me, the woods, and a few days of silence. No distractions, no city noise, no people. I wanted to get away, clear my head, and maybe write a little. What happened instead was a series of things I never thought I'd experience, and it all came down to one thing: the feeling of being watched, hunted, and trapped, with no one coming to help. I arrived in the afternoon, just before the sun started dropping behind the trees. The cabin was deep in the woods, maybe a couple hours' drive from the nearest town, hidden by thick pines and uneven ground. I had been here once before, but only for a day. This time, I was alone and planned to stay 3 nights. The place was old but sturdy, a wooden structure with a tin roof, a chimney, and a small porch with a rusty swing. No electricity, no running water, just an outhouse down a little path. The air smelled clean, heavy with pine and dirt, and a slight chill hinted at the coming fall. I pulled my bags inside, set down my supplies: food, water, a small camping stove, some batteries, and a flashlight. The cabin was basic. A main room with a table, a wood stove for heat, a few chairs, and a small bed in the corner. A cracked window looked out onto the woods. It was the kind of place that could feel cozy in the daytime but might get lonely and strange when the sun went down. I decided to start a fire to warm the room and make some tea. Outside, the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and squirrels, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I gathered some dry wood from a nearby pile, carefully started the fire, and sat back, watching the flames flicker and crackle. The fire made the cabin feel safer, almost like a shield against the dark. As the sky grew darker, I moved to the window and looked out. The trees swayed gently, shadows lengthening and deepening. The silence of the woods was different from the noise of the city. It was heavier, almost thick, and I felt a strange tightness in my chest. I told myself it was just being alone in the wild, nothing more. I spent the evening writing notes in my journal, planning the next day's hike, and listening to the fire pop. Around 10 p.m., I got up to stretch and grabbed my flashlight. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the night outside was pitch black except for the occasional blink of stars. When I shone the flashlight through the window, the beam cut through the darkness and landed on the trees. That's when I noticed it. A pair of eyes reflecting back at me from the edge of the clearing, about 50 feet away. They were small and low to the ground, glowing orange in the beam. My heart skipped. I froze, staring, but the eyes didn't move. After a few seconds, they vanished. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or some other animal, but I'd never seen eyes that bright and still at night. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside with the flashlight to check the area, but there was nothing. No tracks, no movement, no sound other than the usual night noises. I went back inside and locked the door, though there was only a simple latch. I felt uneasy but didn't want to overreact. Animals could be curious, I told myself. Maybe a fox or a bobcat. I checked my phone, no signal. That was expected. I made a mental note to be careful and stay close to the cabin after dark. The night passed slowly. Every crack of the wood, every snap of a twig outside made me jump. I stayed near the fire, watching the shadows dance on the walls. The wind picked up, causing branches to scrape against the cabin roof. Once, I thought I heard a low growl coming from the woods, but it was hard to tell if it was real or just my imagination. Morning came with a faint glow through the window. I felt tired but relieved. The sun always brought some comfort. I packed a small bag, filled my water bottle, and planned a short hike to a nearby stream. I wanted to get some fresh water and maybe a better look around the area. The forest was quiet but alive. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. I followed a narrow trail, careful with my steps, noticing old tree stumps, moss-covered rocks, and the occasional animal track in the mud. The stream was small but clear, running over smooth stones, and I filled my bottle. I stayed for a few minutes, enjoying the sun on my face and the sound of water. As I turned back, I saw something odd: broken branches and flattened grass near the path, as if something large had pushed through. I scanned the woods but saw nothing. The feeling of being watched returned. I hurried back to the cabin, glancing over my shoulder more than once. Back inside, I locked the door and sat by the fire, trying to shake off the unease. I ate some canned food and tried to write, but my mind kept drifting. I checked my phone again, still no signal. The isolation was sinking in. That night, things got worse. Around midnight, I woke to a strange noise outside. A deep, low growl followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching leaves and breaking branches. I froze, heart pounding, listening carefully. The sounds circled the cabin slowly, moving closer, then farther, but never disappearing. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window, shining the beam into the darkness. The trees stood silent, shadows thick and deep. Then I saw it again, a large shape moving just beyond the tree line. It was too dark to see clearly, but the outline was massive, low to the ground, and it moved with a slow, deliberate pace. I remembered all the stories I had heard about wolves and bears in these woods. I had taken precautions, but I hadn't expected anything like this. I went to the wood stove and threw more logs on the fire, hoping the light and heat would keep it away. I grabbed a heavy stick from the corner, ready to defend myself if needed. I stayed close to the door, watching, waiting, feeling trapped. Hours passed. The sounds continued: growls, branches snapping, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. At one point, the windows rattled as if something tried to push or claw at them. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't break through. Eventually, the noises slowed, then stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I stayed awake until dawn, eyes wide open, flashlight in hand, ready for anything. When the sun rose, the woods looked calm again. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. Near the cabin, I found deep paw prints pressed into the dirt, at least a foot long, and scratch marks on the wooden door frame. The ground was disturbed, and bits of fur clung to the porch railing. I took pictures with my phone, trying to document what I saw, though I still had no signal to send them anywhere. I packed quickly that morning, not wanting to spend another night in that cabin. I gathered my things, took one last look at the dark woods, and started the long hike back to my car. The whole way, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling that heavy presence just behind me. When I finally reached the road and drove away, I didn't stop until I was back in town, surrounded by people and noise. Later, I learned from a local ranger that a large wolf or maybe a bear had been spotted nearby recently. Something unusually aggressive, moving close to human dwellings. The ranger warned me that wild animals can be dangerous, especially when food is scarce in the fall. I never went back to that cabin. The memory of those growls in the night, the heavy footsteps circling, and the feeling of being hunted stayed with me. I realized that sometimes nature isn't peaceful or beautiful. It can be cold, dark, and terrifying. And when you're alone in the woods, you're never really safe. I didn't plan on spending the night in that cabin. It wasn't something I had on my list or even thought about until the last minute. I was driving through the mountains on a long road trip, alone, looking for a place to rest before heading home. The sun was low, and the sky was painted with pale orange and pink. The road curved sharply, lined with tall pine trees whose tops were lost in the thick mist rolling in. The chill in the air was sudden and biting, not what I expected in late summer. I was tired, and the thought of driving in the dark over unfamiliar mountain roads wasn't appealing. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A small wooden cabin set back from the road, half hidden by dense shrubs and tall trees. It looked old but solid, with dark wood panels weathered by years of wind and rain. The windows were grimy, but the faint glow of a lantern inside suggested someone had been there recently. A hand-painted wooden sign hung crookedly near the door, the words barely legible but still clear enough to read. For rent. I pulled over without hesitation, needing shelter. The gravel driveway crunched under my tires as I parked. I grabbed my bag and flashlight and made my way up the narrow path to the cabin. The air smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and something faintly metallic. I pressed the doorbell, but there was no answer. No surprise. The place looked isolated. I pulled the heavy door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet evening. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, with smoke and a faint sourness, probably from being closed up for a while. The inside was small but cozy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a few logs stacked neatly beside it. The furniture was sparse: an old wooden table, 2 chairs, a small kitchenette with a rusty sink, and a narrow bed covered with a faded blanket. A cracked mirror hung crookedly near the door. The floorboards creaked underfoot. I switched on the lantern hanging on the wall and set my bag down. The electricity wasn't working, so I had to rely on the lantern and my flashlight. I knew I couldn't drive any further that night. The fog was thickening, and the winding roads were treacherous. I decided to stay at least for a few hours, maybe even sleep here. I unpacked my sleeping bag and some food I had in the car, then went outside to gather firewood. The trees were dense and close, their branches scratching against the cabin walls when the wind blew. The quiet was almost overwhelming. No birds, no insects, just the soft rustle of leaves and distant creaks of trees bending in the wind. I managed to get a fire going in the fireplace with the dry wood I found inside and the small pile of twigs outside. The warm glow pushed back the shadows in the room, but it also made the darkness outside feel deeper and more oppressive. I settled near the fire, eating some bread and canned beans, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. The night outside was cold and still, with only the occasional howl of wind through the trees. As the fire burned lower, I heard something, the faint noise from outside. It wasn't the usual creaks or the wind. It was subtle, something scratching at the cabin's outer walls. My heart skipped. I froze, listening carefully. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the door, peeking outside. The beam cut through the thick fog, revealing nothing but the trees and shadows. No animals, no people. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a squirrel, looking for food. But the scratching continued, moving around the cabin. It wasn't frantic or panicked like an animal trapped would sound. It was patient, measured, like something trying to get in but not in a hurry. I locked the door and pulled the curtains over the windows, then sat back down by the fire, trying to calm down. Hours passed. The fire dwindled to glowing embers. The noises outside became more frequent, branches snapping, low thuds against the walls. I stayed awake, my back against the stone hearth, my eyes darting to the windows, feeling the cold sweat of fear on my skin. The night seemed endless. Every sound was magnified, every shadow a threat. At some point, I fell into a restless sleep. I woke suddenly to the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel path outside. Heavy, slow steps, not like an animal. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. My heart hammered. Then silence. I forced myself not to move, not to make a sound. The wind blew harder, rattling the windows. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved again, away from the cabin and into the woods. I waited a long time before I dared to open the door. Outside, the fog had grown thick, swallowing the trees in a gray haze. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, heavy boots, too large for me to tell more. The prints led away from the road and into the deep woods, disappearing after a few steps. I went back inside and locked the door again, closing every curtain and shutter I could find. I sat down, trying to think clearly. Why was someone walking around here at this hour? Why had they stopped outside the cabin? I thought about calling the police, but there was no cell service. The mountains always made communication difficult. I tried to stay awake all night, but exhaustion pulled me under. When morning finally broke, I was shaking with cold and fear. I looked out the window to see a thick fog still hanging over the trees. The footprints from the night before were gone, erased by the rain that had started while I slept. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly and made sure the fire was out. Before leaving, I checked the cabin carefully. The windows were all locked. Nothing was disturbed inside except for the scratches on the outer walls, deeper and more numerous than before. The wood had been clawed at, gouged by something big and strong. I didn't see any signs of forced entry or theft, but I knew something had been watching, something that wanted in. I got in my car and started the engine, the vibration steady and reassuring. As I pulled away, I looked back at the cabin, shrinking behind the trees. I realized the road I had taken was the only way out, and if someone wanted to stop me, they could have easily done so. The whole trip back down the mountain was tense. Every shadow by the roadside looked like a person waiting to block the road. Every noise in the trees sounded like footsteps. I kept the doors locked and the windows up, eyes fixed on the road. By the time I reached the nearest town and had cell signal, I called the local sheriff's office. I reported the strange noises and footprints around the cabin, the heavy footsteps, and the scratches on the wood. They told me other hikers and travelers had reported similar things. People wandering in the woods, sometimes hiding or watching cabins and campsites. No one had been caught yet. They said it might be hunters or drifters, people who lived off the grid, but some reports mentioned them being aggressive or dangerous. I never went back to that cabin or the mountain roads. I changed my route and avoided that area entirely. The experience left a mark on me. The feeling of being watched, the sound of those heavy footsteps in the night, the unknown presence outside my door. It was a raw, real kind of fear that didn't go away. Sometimes I think about that night, how close I was to something I didn't understand, something human but wild, desperate or dangerous. It wasn't a ghost or a monster, just a person or maybe more than one, out there in the dark woods waiting and watching. It reminded me how alone you can be in the wilderness, how thin the line is between safety and danger. The cabin still stands, I'm sure, weathered and empty, waiting for the next traveler who thinks they'll find a safe place in the mountains. But there's nothing safe about it. Not really. Not in those woods, where something is always moving, always listening, and sometimes it's closer than you think. It was late October when I decided to escape the city for a few days. The stress of work and life had been building for months, and the idea of a quiet cabin in the woods sounded like the perfect remedy. I found a small cabin for rent, deep in the forest, far from the noise and crowds. The photos showed a rustic wooden cabin with a stone chimney, surrounded by tall pine trees and a narrow dirt road leading in. It looked isolated, peaceful, exactly what I wanted. I arrived just before sunset. The sky was a clear mix of soft orange and darkening blue, the kind of evening that feels like the last warm breath of fall before winter takes hold. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of dry leaves in the wind. As I pulled up to the cabin, I noticed how the tall trees crowded in close, their shadows stretching across the dirt road like dark fingers. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. It smelled like old wood and faint smoke from the chimney. Inside, it was simple, a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a table with 2 chairs, a sofa that looked well used, and a stone fireplace. There was a single bedroom through a door at the back and a small bathroom. The windows were covered in thin, dusty curtains. I unpacked my things quickly and made a fire in the fireplace. The crackling sound was comforting. Outside, the last light faded, and the forest turned into a sea of black. The first night was quiet, the kind of peaceful quiet that comes when you're far away from everything. I slept well, wrapped in blankets, feeling safe inside the sturdy walls. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and a cold breeze sneaking in through the slightly cracked window. I brewed some coffee on the stove, then decided to explore the area. The forest was dense, the trees thick with layers of dried leaves. The ground was covered in pine needles and small branches, making soft crackling sounds underfoot. The air smelled sharp and fresh, the scent of earth and wood mixing with the faint smell of smoke from some distant campfire. I walked along a narrow path that ran behind the cabin, heading deeper into the woods. The trees grew even thicker here, and the canopy above was so dense that only bits of sky showed through. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was, almost too quiet. There were no other sounds but my footsteps and the occasional call of a distant bird. No other people, no vehicles, no planes overhead, just the forest. I found a small creek a short distance from the cabin. The water was clear but icy cold, trickling slowly over smooth stones. I bent down to drink some water, tasting the freshness and coolness. Nearby, I spotted tracks in the mud. They looked like deer prints, but they were large and not very clear. I thought nothing of it at first, assuming the ground was soft and had distorted the shapes. As the day went on, I spent time inside the cabin reading and resting. The fire kept the room warm despite the chill outside. The sky outside darkened early, the forest quickly swallowing the fading light. The windows showed nothing but black shapes and shadows, trees blending into the night. That second night, I was woken by a noise. It was faint at first, a low scratching or scraping sound coming from outside. I stayed still, trying to figure out what it was. The sound repeated, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the front door. I got up quietly and looked out the window. The porch light was off, and the darkness beyond was thick. I could barely see the shapes of the trees, and the dirt road disappeared into shadows. I stepped outside cautiously, the cool night air sharp against my skin. The forest was silent except for the sound of dry leaves moving in the wind. There was nothing on the porch, no footprints or signs of anyone having been there. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. Back inside, I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a stray dog scratching at the wood. But the noise had a certain rhythm, almost like something trying to get in. I sat by the fire for a long time after that, watching the flames and listening carefully. The next day, I found more evidence that something had been around the cabin. Near the back door, I saw fresh scratches on the wood frame, deep gouges as if made by claws. The dirt on the porch had several large, deep prints that I couldn't identify for sure. They didn't look like any animal tracks I knew. I began to feel uneasy. The forest felt different now, less peaceful, more watching. I kept my phone with me, but there was no signal, no way to call for help or even check in with the outside world. That afternoon, I decided to explore a bit further down the road. The dirt track led deeper into the woods, curving around hills and crossing over small bridges. The trees became older and thicker. The air was colder, heavier, as if the forest was closing in. As I walked, I heard the crack of a branch behind me. I spun around but saw nothing, just empty forest. My heart started to race. I kept moving but slower, more cautious. The shadows grew longer and darker as the sun lowered. I decided to head back before night fell. But then I noticed something strange. The dirt road, which had been clear and well-worn, now looked disrupted. There were fresh marks in the dirt, large and deep. They looked like something heavy had been dragged across, scraping the earth. I followed the marks, curiosity mixed with fear. They led off the road and into the trees. The underbrush was thick, and the trail disappeared quickly. Still, I pressed on, moving carefully through the bushes. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of movement. A large shape slipping between the trees, too big and fast to be a deer or a normal forest animal. My heart pounded. I stopped and watched, barely breathing. It was a bear, not a small one either. This was a big male, judging by the size of its shoulders and head. Its fur was dark brown and thick, and it moved with a slow, deliberate power. I felt frozen in place. The bear disappeared behind the trees, but I could see the ground was disturbed where it had been. The scratches on the cabin, the heavy prints, they all suddenly made sense. A bear was nearby. I knew bears were common in this region, but I had never been this close to one before. The knowledge made my skin crawl. I hurried back to the cabin as the light faded. The forest felt alive with sounds. The snapping of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an owl. I locked the doors and windows tightly, made another fire, and stayed alert. That night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed amplified. A branch tapping the window, a sudden rustle in the bushes. I kept the fire burning all night, the flickering flames my only comfort. The following morning, I woke early and decided to leave. I packed quickly, not wanting to stay any longer than necessary. But when I stepped outside, I found the back door had been clawed again. Fresh, deep marks across the wood, as if something had tried to force its way in. I felt trapped, vulnerable. The cabin, which had seemed like a safe haven, now felt like a cage. I loaded my bags into the car and started the engine. As I pulled away, I saw the dark shape standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. The bear was massive, its eyes reflecting the early morning light. It didn't move, just stood still as I drove away. The road back was slow and tense. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting the bear to follow. Didn't. When I finally reached the main highway, I felt a deep relief. The city's noise and lights felt overwhelming but safe compared to the forest. Looking back, I realized how naive I had been to think I could just retreat into the wild without respect for its dangers. The bear hadn't been hunting me out of malice. It was defending its territory, disturbed by my presence. That experience stayed with me long after. The scratches on the cabin, the heavy prints, the silent watcher in the woods, they were reminders that nature doesn't negotiate or warn. It simply is. I never thought a simple trip to a cabin in the woods would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I had planned it as a quiet escape, a chance to get away from the noise of the city and the constant buzzing of work emails. Just me, nature, and a few days of silence. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, tucked deep in a forest I hadn't explored before. When I arrived, the sky was already tinged with the soft orange of the late afternoon. The road had been rough, gravel and dirt, twisting through thick pines and oaks. I parked the car on a small patch of flattened dirt just outside the cabin. It wasn't much. A small wooden structure with a porch and a chimney, built low to the ground and covered in faded green paint peeling in spots. The windows were dusty, but I could see the sunlight flickering through the cracks in the curtains. I had come prepared. My backpack was stuffed with canned food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, some matches, and a good knife. The cabin had no electricity or running water, so I knew I would have to rely on my supplies and the nearby stream marked on the map I had printed out. The first thing I did was light a fire in the stone fireplace. The wood was dry and crackled loudly as the flames grew. I felt a strange comfort watching the fire. The cabin smelled old but clean, like wood and moss and something faintly like smoke from many years ago. I opened the window to let the fresh air in and settled down with a book. As the sun disappeared and night fell, the forest around the cabin became a thick black wall. No streetlights, no cars, no sounds but the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. It was peaceful but also unfamiliar. The kind of peace that feels like silence is holding its breath, waiting. That first night, I slept in the small loft above the main room. The bed was just a thin mattress on a wooden frame, but it was enough. I woke a few times to the sounds outside, branches snapping, something heavy moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was probably a deer or some raccoon. Nothing more. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I followed the narrow trail that led downhill from the cabin toward the stream I had seen on the map. The path was overgrown, and the damp earth smelled fresh. The stream was small, clear, and cold. I filled my water bottle there and rested on a rock, watching the way the sunlight caught the water as it rushed over stones. On my way back, I noticed something odd. The trail looked like it had been recently disturbed. There were broken twigs and flattened grass, like someone or something had passed through not long ago. I scanned the trees, but saw no signs of people. No footprints in the soft earth. Only animal tracks, maybe a large dog or a wolf. That night, the feeling of being watched crept over me. I checked the locks on the cabin door and windows, even though I knew it was probably just the wind playing tricks on my mind. But every time I looked out, the trees seemed to lean closer, shadows shifting just beyond the edge of the firelight. On the third day, things got worse. I heard noises right outside the cabin, low growls and scratching at the door. The wood creaked under pressure, as if something heavy was pushing against it. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, heart pounding. I waited until the noises stopped, then cautiously opened the door a crack. Nothing, just the dark forest, silent again. I found deep scratches in the wood near the handle, claw marks that looked fresh. I realized the creature wasn't just an animal passing through. It was hunting, watching me. I spent the day barricading the cabin as best as I could with fallen branches and rocks. I stacked firewood by the door and blocked the windows with shutters nailed tightly shut. The forest was alive with sounds. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake beside the fire, gripping my knife, listening for the slightest sound. When the scratching started again, I shone the flashlight into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw two glowing eyes staring back. Then they vanished. The next morning, I realized my phone had no signal, no calls, no messages. I was completely cut off. The situation felt desperate. I knew I had to get out, but the forest around the cabin was thick and wild. I decided to wait for daylight and then make a break for the car, hoping to avoid whatever was stalking me. When morning came, the air was cold and still. I packed quickly, taking only the essentials. As I stepped outside, I froze. The ground around the cabin was littered with large paw prints, They surrounded the cabin like a ring. I didn't wait any longer. I ran. The forest seemed endless, but I kept moving, following the rough track back toward the road. Branches whipped at my face, and my breath came in short gasps. Behind me, I could hear the sounds again, the heavy thuds of something large chasing. I didn't look back. I just ran. After what felt like hours, I burst out onto the gravel road and saw my car parked under the fading light. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The forest fell away behind me as I sped down the dirt road toward civilization. It was only when I reached the highway and saw other cars and people that I allowed myself to breathe. The fear was still there, but I was safe. Looking back, I realized what I had faced was not some ghost or spirit, but a wild animal. A bear or a large wolf, territorial and hungry. I was lucky to get away. From then on, I never went back to that cabin, and I never underestimated the power of nature again. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth when I arrived at the cabin. It was late afternoon, the sun just starting to dip behind the tall trees that crowded the forest around the clearing where the small wooden cabin sat. The place looked isolated, exactly what I was hoping for. I needed a break from everything, a few days to clear my head far from the noise of the city and people. The cabin was old but sturdy. It had a simple porch, a creaky wooden door with rusty hinges, and windows clouded from years of dust and weather. I unlocked the door with a key I had gotten from the rental office earlier in town. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, old wood, and faint traces of smoke from the stone fireplace in the living room. The walls were made of thick logs, and the floorboards creaked under my boots as I stepped inside. I dropped my bag by the door and went straight to the fireplace. I wanted to get a fire going before night fell completely. Outside, the forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or a distant bird call. I had read a lot about how this area could get cold at night, even in summer, so I had packed enough firewood to last for days. Setting the kindling carefully, I lit the fire and watched as the flames slowly caught and spread. The warmth spread quickly, filling the cabin with a golden glow and chasing away the cold that had followed me inside. I felt a small wave of relief, as if the fire was a shield against the unknown waiting outside. The cabin had a small kitchen area with a rusted sink and a stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I had brought some canned food and water with me. I unpacked my things slowly, trying to make the place feel more like my own. There was a tiny bedroom with a single bed, and a small bathroom with a cracked mirror and a leaky faucet. As night grew darker outside, the sounds of the forest changed. The daytime birds were gone, replaced by crickets and distant howls I couldn't quite place. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making every small noise louder than it should be. I sat by the fire with a cup of coffee, my eyes darting around the cabin, trying to stay calm. Around 10 p.m., I decided to get ready for bed. I cleaned up a bit, brushed my teeth, and switched off the lights, leaving only the fire to flicker in the corner. The windows were open slightly to let fresh air in, but the darkness beyond them was thick and uninviting. I lay on the bed, the old mattress creaking under me, and tried to let the calmness of the place take over. But sleep didn't come easily. The forest was alive outside, and every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made my heart jump. I told myself it was just animals moving about, deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. After a while, I heard a noise I couldn't explain, a low, slow scraping sound coming from just outside the cabin. It wasn't a snap or a crackle. It was deliberate, like something dragging against the side of the cabin. I held my breath, listening. The scraping stopped. Then it came again, slower this time, moving along the wall near the back door. My mind raced. Maybe it was a branch caught in the wind, but the wind was calm tonight. Maybe a bear or a big animal curious about the cabin. I didn't want to open the door to check. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight I had on the nightstand and slowly crept to the window that looked out on the back porch. I pointed the beam into the dark but saw nothing at first. Then, just beyond the porch, something moved quickly out of the light's reach. I froze, heart pounding. The shape was big, low to the ground, too big for a raccoon or a fox. A bear? Possibly. I backed away from the window, my mind running through what I knew about bears in the area. They mostly avoid humans, but if they smelled food or something interesting, they might come close. I had locked all my food inside a sealed container, but maybe something smelled out here. I decided to stay inside, lock all the doors, and keep the fire burning through the night. The scraping noises came and went, always outside, always near the back door. I stayed awake for hours, flashlight in hand, listening. At some point, the sounds stopped. I think exhaustion finally got to me, and I drifted into a light sleep. Morning came slow and gray. The sun tried to break through the thick clouds, but the sky stayed dull. I got up, stretched, and looked outside. The porch had scratch marks on the wood near the back door. Deep gouges, as if something with sharp claws had tried to claw its way inside. There were also large paw prints in the mud just beyond the porch steps. I took a deep breath. I was dealing with a bear. That much was clear. I told myself not to panic. People had cabins all over these woods, and bears were part of life here. They usually stayed away from humans, but this one was bold. I checked the cabin carefully for any other damage. Nothing else was broken, no doors or windows forced open. Still, the bear had been close, very close. I knew I couldn't stay outside for long that day. The bear might still be nearby, watching, waiting. I made a quick plan to gather my things, leave the cabin, and hike back to the main road where I could get a signal and call for help if I needed it. I ate a quick breakfast, then packed my bag. Before leaving, I grabbed the hunting knife I had brought along, just in case. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As I stepped outside, the forest felt heavier. The bear had left its scent everywhere. The crushed grass, the broken branches, the claw marks. I moved quickly but carefully, not wanting to make too much noise. The trail back to the road was narrow and covered in leaves and fallen branches. I followed it as best I could, but after about 20 minutes, I heard something behind me. A heavy thud against a tree. I froze. The sounds were too heavy to be a small animal. I glanced back and saw a massive black shape moving between the trees, keeping to the shadows. Panic surged through me. I started walking faster, almost running now, heart hammering in my chest. The noise followed me. A heavy step, then silence, then a branch snapped. I knew I couldn't outrun a bear, but I also knew that running straight away could trigger a chase instinct. I stopped and turned slowly, holding the knife out in front of me. The bear appeared at the edge of the clearing, large and dark against the gray sky. Its eyes caught the faint light, and it growled low in its throat. I stayed still, trying to look as big as possible, making myself as threatening as I could. The bear took a step forward, sniffed the air, then stopped. For what felt like forever, it just stared at me. Then, slowly, it turned and disappeared back into the woods. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I moved fast, nearly running now until I reached the road. At the road, I finally found a spot with a cell signal. I called the local ranger station and told them what had happened. They told me they'd send someone out as soon as possible and warned me not to go back to the cabin until they had checked it. I waited by the road for hours, shaking and exhausted. A few hours later, a ranger arrived in a truck. He listened to my story, checked the area near the cabin, and confirmed the signs were from a large black bear. He said the bear was likely attracted by the smell of food or something else, and that it was rare but not unheard of for bears to get aggressive or curious near human dwellings. He advised me to keep food sealed, never leave scraps outside, and always be alert. The ranger said he would set up traps to catch and relocate the bear if it continued to come near. I never went back to that cabin. The idea of staying there alone after what I had experienced was impossible. The woods are beautiful, and solitude can be healing, but they are also wild and dangerous in ways that no fairy tale or ghost story can explain. Sometimes the scariest things are the real ones. Animals acting on instinct, the raw power of nature reminding you where you truly stand. That night, I learned how close the edge of safety really is, how quickly peace can turn into danger, and how sometimes the best choice is simply to leave. The sky was already dark when I arrived at the cabin, the last hints of sunlight slipping behind thick, heavy clouds. The forest around the clearing felt dense and silent, the trees standing tall like quiet watchers. I'd been looking forward to this weekend alone. Just me, the cabin, and the woods. I needed a break from everything, a few days of peace. But from the moment I parked my car and stepped onto the soft earth, something about the place felt off, even though I couldn't put my finger on why. The cabin itself was small and old, built of dark logs with a steep roof covered in moss. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. The windows were dusty, and the door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and damp earth, mixed with something faintly metallic that I couldn't identify. The place was mostly empty, with just the basics. A small kitchen, a wood stove, a rickety table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. The walls were bare except for a few rusty nails that looked like they once held pictures. I dropped my bag on the floor and took a deep breath. The silence pressed in on me, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. The creak of a floorboard, the rustle of leaves outside, the distant call of a bird. I found a pile of old firewood stacked near the door and started gathering some to build a fire. The temperature was already dropping, and I knew the night would be cold. As I worked, I kept glancing out the windows. The forest seemed darker now, the trees blotting out what little moonlight might have been. Shadows moved between the trunks, but I told myself it was just the wind or animals. Still, I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, like something unseen was watching me. Once the fire was going, the cabin felt a little less suffocating. The orange glow from the stove flickered across the walls, casting long shadows. I sat down at the table and pulled out a notebook, thinking I might write a little, but my hands were shaking. I wasn't sure why. I stared into the flames for a long time, listening to the crackling wood and the silence beyond the windows. Hours passed. I hadn't heard any animals or other people, just the wind pushing through the trees. At some point, the fire died down to glowing embers. I got up and added more wood, then went to check the door. It was still locked and the windows were all shut tight. The forest outside was black except for a narrow strip of sky, thick with clouds. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound from outside the cabin, like nails or claws scraping against wood. My heart jumped. I stood very still, listening. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. I waited, but nothing else happened. I told myself it was a tree branch scraping against the side of the cabin in the wind, or maybe a small animal. But the sound was too deliberate, too sharp. I decided to check the perimeter outside, just to be sure. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air hit my face, sharp and biting. I swept the light across the trees and the clearing around the cabin. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. The cabin's wooden walls were worn and scratched, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Then I noticed scratches. Long, deep claw marks gouged into the wood near the corner of the cabin. They were fresh, the edges raw and splintered. My skin crawled. Whoever or whatever had done this had to be strong, dangerous even. I checked the rest of the cabin walls, but the scratches were only on one side, the side facing the thickest part of the forest. My mind raced with possibilities. Bears, mountain lions, or worse. I didn't want to think about what had come this close. I hurried back inside and locked the door again, barricading it with a heavy chair. I checked all the windows, making sure they were secure. Then I sat down again near the stove, trying to calm my pounding heart. The night stretched on, slow and heavy. Every small sound outside made me tense. The wind whispered through the trees, sometimes carrying strange noises, low growls, snapping branches, the crunch of something large moving through the underbrush. I kept telling myself it was just the forest, that animals had to live here, but the scratches on the cabin told me this was more than that. Around midnight, the power went out. I hadn't even realized the cabin was wired to the grid. The small electric lamp I'd brought flickered and died. Now it was just me, the dark, and the faint glow from the dying fire. I heard the scratching again, louder this time, coming from the side of the cabin with the marks. It was slower, more deliberate, like something testing the wood, looking for a way in. My breathing was shallow, and my hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles turned white. Suddenly, a heavy thump shook the cabin wall. Then another. Something large was pushing against the wood, trying to get inside. I backed away, my eyes wide in the dim light. The chair at the door rattled as I moved it closer, trying to block any path. The noise went on for what felt like minutes. Thuds, scratches, and heavy breathing from outside. The cabin groaned under the pressure. I could feel the floor vibrate beneath my feet. Then it stopped. Silence fell again, thick and suffocating. I waited a long time before daring to move. The fire was almost out, so I grabbed what was left of the wood and threw it on. Flames sparked back to life, lighting the room with a weak orange glow. I crept to the window and peered out. The clearing was empty. No sign of anything or anyone. The claw marks were still there, but nothing else. I felt exhausted but knew I couldn't stay awake forever. I pulled my jacket tight and lay down on the bed, my eyes fixed on the door. Every time the wind howled, I thought I heard something moving outside. Hours later, just before dawn, I woke to a strange smell, something sharp and metallic. I sat up slowly and looked around. The door was still barricaded, but the window next to the bed was open, a crack wide enough to see outside. The glass was broken. My heart sank. Someone or something had been inside while I slept. I checked the room carefully. Nothing was missing except my backpack, the one with my phone, flashlight, and a few supplies. Whoever had broken in took it. I felt completely exposed. I wanted to leave immediately but knew I couldn't drive in the dark through the forest. I decided to wait for first light. When the sun finally rose, the forest looked less threatening but still cold and unwelcoming. I packed what little I had left and stepped outside. The claw marks on the cabin seemed even deeper in the daylight. As I walked to my car, I spotted fresh footprints in the mud, large, heavy, and not human. They led toward the forest, then vanished near a cluster of dense bushes. I never found out exactly what was out there. No police would come to investigate something so remote, and there was no evidence left except those marks and broken glass. The experience stayed with me, a shadow I couldn't shake. The forest wasn't just silent. It was waiting, watching. I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or stories, but real, dangerous creatures that live beyond the edge of light and civilization. From then on, I never went back to that cabin. The quiet in the woods wasn't peace. It was a warning. The sun was sinking low behind the thick pine trees when I finally pulled up to the cabin. It sat in a small clearing deep in the woods, isolated and quiet except for the soft whisper of wind through the branches. I had planned this weekend getaway for months. A chance to get away from the noise of the city, the endless buzz of work emails, and the crowded streets. The cabin was simple but sturdy, built mostly from rough timber logs and a stone chimney curling smoke into the crisp fall air. The whole place smelled like old wood and pine needles, and the silence around it felt heavy and thick, almost like a presence that pressed in on you. I stepped out of my car and stretched my arms, feeling the cold bite of the evening air. My breath puffed out in white clouds as I grabbed my backpack and locked the door behind me. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked to the porch, the wooden boards creaking with each step. The cabin was my only shelter for the next few days, miles from the nearest neighbor or any hint of civilization. Inside, the cabin was small and sparsely furnished but warm, with the faint smell of wood smoke lingering in the air. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, empty except for some cold ashes. I set my bag down and lit a small lantern on the rough wooden table, its flickering glow casting shadows on the walls. The window panes were old and slightly fogged, but they gave a clear view of the dense forest outside, thick with trees that seemed to close in on the cabin like they were guarding some secret. I unpacked slowly, placing my food supplies in the small cupboard and stacking firewood near the hearth. The sun had dipped behind the trees, and the forest outside grew darker, swallowing the edges of the clearing until it was just a black wall around me. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig, but the woods felt almost unnervingly still. No birdsong, no small animals scurrying about, just silence pressing down. I built a fire in the hearth, striking matches until the kindling caught flame. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the rough wooden walls. I sat close to the hearth with a mug of coffee, the warmth spreading through me as I listened to the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the distant wind moving through the branches. As night fell fully, I felt a strange sense of unease creep in. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the awareness of how alone I was, how small this cabin was compared to the vast, dark forest outside. I reminded myself this was exactly what I wanted, peace and solitude, but the silence was too perfect, almost unnatural. The woods usually have noises, animals moving, birds calling, the rustle of the wind in the leaves, but here, there was none of that, just the quiet, stretching on endlessly. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The cabin was old but solid, with thick logs that blocked the cold and kept out most sounds. Still, every now and then, I heard noises, small cracks and creaks from the wood settling. I told myself, or maybe animals outside moving through the underbrush. Hours passed. I tried to keep busy, reading a book by firelight and sipping coffee, but the darkness outside seemed to grow heavier. The firelight felt weak against the vast blackness pressing in. I kept glancing toward the windows, where the trees looked like shadowy giants, barely moving. Then, just as I was about to put out the lantern and go to bed, I heard it, a soft but sharp noise, a light tapping or scratching sound coming from outside. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, but it was definitely there. Something was moving near the cabin. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, a light scrape against wood, like nails or claws dragging slowly along the siding. My heart started beating faster, but I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a deer brushing against the walls. The forest was full of wildlife, after all. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was watching. The wind had died down, and the woods were utterly silent except for that scratching noise. It didn't come from one place but moved around the cabin, circling slowly. I grabbed a flashlight and stood up, shining the beam through the window. The forest was dark, but the light cut through some of the shadows. I scanned the trees, looking for any movement. For a long moment, I saw nothing but darkness and the outlines of branches. Then the scratching stopped. I waited, holding the flashlight steady, the beam shaking slightly in my hand. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a quick flash near the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded hard enough to hear in my ears. I went to the door and looked out into the darkness. The beam of my flashlight swept the clearing again. The forest was still. No animals, no movement except the shadows. I closed the door slowly and locked it again, pulling the bolt tight. The scratching had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I sat back down by the fire, trying to calm my racing mind. Sleep came slowly that night. Every small noise, branches snapping, leaves rustling, made me jump. The cabin groaned as the temperature dropped, with settling and contracting in the cold. Outside, the forest seemed endless and empty, but I knew it was full of life, just not the kind I wanted to meet. When dawn finally broke, the pale light filtered through the window, softening the darkness. I got up and checked outside. The clearing was empty, the ground covered in fallen leaves. But then I noticed something. Deep scratches on the wooden siding of the cabin, fresh and jagged. They weren't claw marks like from a small animal. These were bigger, deeper, made by something strong. I walked around the cabin slowly, inspecting the marks. They ran along the lower logs, starting near the back and circling around toward the front. There were no footprints in the soft earth, no other signs of movement, just the scratches and the silence. The scratches chilled me more than anything else. Whatever had been out there had the strength to claw at the cabin itself. It wasn't a small animal. It was big, and it had been close enough to touch the walls. I packed up quickly after that, wanting to get out of the forest while I still could. As I loaded my things into the car, I kept looking over my shoulder at the trees, feeling eyes on me from the shadows. The sun was climbing higher now, and the woods looked less menacing in the light, but the memory of last night stayed heavy in my chest. Driving away from the cabin, I felt a deep relief as the trees thinned and the road appeared ahead. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, surrounded by people and noise and safety. The forest was behind me, dark and quiet again, hiding whatever had been out there that night. Even now, I can't forget those scratches on the cabin wall or the silence that swallowed the woods. I don't know exactly what it was that came so close, but I do know this. Some places are best left alone. The forest was not just empty trees and quiet air. It held something wild, something strong, that reminded me how small and vulnerable I really am. And that's a lesson I won't forget. The first time I saw the cabin, it looked like a forgotten place on the edge of the woods. It wasn't fancy or welcoming, just a small, weather-beaten wooden structure with peeling paint and a sagging roof. But after weeks of city noise and endless screen time, I wanted to be somewhere quiet, somewhere away from everything. Somewhere like this cabin, nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I wanted the solitude. I wanted to be alone with my thoughts, away from the endless buzz of people and city lights. So I packed up my car with a few basic supplies: a tent, some food, a sleeping bag, matches, and a small camping stove, and drove out of town just before dawn. The sun was just starting to push through the trees when I pulled onto a narrow dirt path. It was rough, covered with loose rocks and fallen branches. I drove slowly, careful not to get stuck. The forest grew thicker around me, tall pines and thick underbrush closing in on the road. After about 30 minutes, the road ended abruptly at a small clearing. The cabin sat there like a relic from another time. I stepped out of the car and took a long look around. There was no power, no running water, no other buildings in sight. Just me, the cabin, and the forest. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. The silence was almost too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every tiny sound. The crunch of leaves underfoot, a distant bird call, the creak of old wood in the wind. I crossed the clearing and pushed open the front door. It groaned on its hinges, and a cloud of dust rose up. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. A single room with a rough wooden table, a few chairs, a small wood stove, and a battered cot pushed into the corner. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dirt and pine needles that had blown in through the cracks around the windows. I unpacked my bag and set up my tent just outside the cabin, thinking I might want the fresh air tonight instead of the cramped inside. Then I built a fire in the stove and sat down at the table with a cup of instant coffee. Outside, the forest darkened as the sun sank behind the trees. As the night fell, the forest sounds grew louder. The chirping of crickets, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I felt a calmness settling over me, a peacefulness I hadn't felt in a long time. But around midnight, something changed. It started as a faint noise, a low thud, like something heavy hitting the ground outside. I froze, listening. The fire crackled. The wind whispered through the trees, but that sound came again. Thud, thud, thud. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but the rhythm was too steady, too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside the cabin. The beam cut through the darkness, lighting up the clearing and the edge of the forest. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing. No movement, no eyes reflecting back. Then I heard it again, this time from the back of the cabin, near the old woodpile. Thud, thud. My heart started to race. I walked cautiously toward the pile, the flashlight shaking in my hand. As I got closer, I saw that one of the logs had shifted, and behind it, there was a trail of broken branches leading deeper into the trees. I didn't want to follow it. I didn't want to know what was out there, but I couldn't ignore it either. I went back inside and locked the door, though I knew the old lock was probably useless. I sat down by the stove, trying to keep calm, trying to focus on the fire instead of the sounds outside. The thudding noises didn't stop. They circled the cabin, coming closer and then fading, like something was pacing, watching me. I thought about leaving. I thought about packing up right then and driving back to the city. But it was the middle of the night, and the road back was long and rough. I didn't want to get stuck out here, so I stayed put. I kept the fire burning and waited for the first light. When dawn came, it brought with it a cold, gray sky and a forest that looked just a little more threatening than before. The logs near the woodpile were scattered, broken in a way that wasn't natural, and the ground around the cabin was marked with strange, heavy footprints, large, uneven, and deep in the soft dirt. I spent the day repairing the door and windows as best I could, using scrap wood I found in the shed. I set up a few makeshift alarms, strings tied to cans and bits of metal, around the perimeter of the clearing. Anything to warn me if something tried to get too close. That night was worse. The thudding came again, louder, more aggressive. It was like the thing outside was testing me, trying to break me down. At one point, I swear I heard something banging on the cabin walls, hard enough to make the whole building shake. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, clutching my hunting knife, ready to defend myself. Morning couldn't come soon enough. When the light finally broke through the trees, I found more signs of the visitor. The firewood was scattered again, the traps I'd set broken. The footprints led off into the woods, but I could tell it had been close. Too close. I gathered my things and decided to leave. There was no way I could stay here alone with whatever was out there. I started the car and began the slow drive back along the dirt road. But as I rounded a bend, I saw it. A huge, dark shape standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I slammed on the brakes. It didn't move, just stood there, tall and still, silhouetted against the gray sky. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could tell it was a wild animal, maybe a bear or something bigger. My heart pounded. I put the car in reverse and backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off it. I drove as fast as I dared down the road, not stopping until I hit the paved highway. Back in town, safe and warm, I told myself it was just a bear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever had stalked me through the night, was something different, something bigger, something that wasn't just an animal passing through. I've never been back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. The woods hide a lot of things, and sometimes you find out the hard way that not all of them want to be left alone. I decided to spend a weekend alone at a remote cabin deep in the woods, far from the noise and light of the city. It wasn't a place I picked randomly. I found it listed on a small rental site, described as rustic but comfortable, with no cell phone signal and miles of forest surrounding it. That's what I wanted: quiet, isolation, a break from everything. No distractions, no people, just nature and me. The drive out there was long and winding, the kind where the pavement turns to gravel, and then gravel gives way to a dirt road that looks like it hasn't seen a car in years. Trees thickened on both sides, tall pine and oak, their branches tangled overhead. The sky was gray and low, but the air smelled fresh, a mix of damp earth and pine needles. When I finally reached the cabin, it sat in a small clearing with wild grass and a few scattered bushes around it. The place looked older than the photos online had shown. Weathered wood, darkened with age, the porch sagging slightly on one side. I parked and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. There was no cell phone signal, just dead silence except for the distant caw of a crow and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The door creaked when I pushed it open, a dry, hollow sound that echoed inside. The cabin smelled like dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic. I set my bag down and started unpacking, ready to make myself comfortable. Inside was sparse but functional. A small kitchen corner with a propane stove, a worn wooden table, a couch covered in a faded blanket, and a bed with a thin mattress in the corner. A wood stove stood near the center of the room, its chimney leading out through the roof. I unpacked some food, water, and my camping gear, planning to spend the first evening getting the stove going and exploring the surrounding woods a little. The sun was already low when I stacked some dry logs in the stove and lit a small fire. The cabin quickly warmed up, and the flickering orange light made the wooden walls look alive, casting moving shadows. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees sway and creak. I sat back with a bottle of water and let the silence settle over me. Night fell fast out here. Without city lights, the darkness was complete, heavy and thick. The windows showed nothing but blackness, and the forest beyond disappeared into shadows. The sounds changed, too. The daytime rustle of birds and insects was replaced by an eerie quiet, broken by distant snapping twigs, the rustling of leaves, and occasional sharp calls of night birds or animals. I kept checking the windows, watching the woods, feeling a little uneasy but telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. It was supposed to be peaceful out here. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, feeling a strange urge to secure everything tightly. The wind pushed against the cabin, rattling the shutters, and the fire crackled in response. Suddenly, I heard a faint scraping sound outside. It was subtle at first, almost like a branch rubbing against the siding. But it wasn't steady. It came and went, like something moving carefully and slowly around the cabin. I froze, listening hard, my heart starting to beat faster. The wind could explain some noises, but this was different, deliberate, quiet, close. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and switched it on. The beam cut through the dark, swinging slowly around the clearing. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I checked all around the cabin once, flashlight in hand, stepping outside and scanning the woods beyond the small clearing. No animals, no people, only the forest, still and dark. Still, the feeling stayed with me. That scraping sound returned a few times, always in different spots near the cabin. It wasn't animal noises, no growls or howls, no running footsteps. It was slow, careful, like someone or something trying not to be noticed. I locked the door again and went back inside, sitting close to the fire. The wind howled louder now, pushing against the walls. The cabin groaned and shifted as if breathing. I tried to calm down, focusing on the warmth and the firelight. The night would pass. It had to. Then I heard it. A soft but clear knocking on the wooden wall outside, near the back door. Not a branch or animal. Solid knocks, steady and slow. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 3 again. Pattern. My heart jumped. I didn't move, didn't speak. I watched the door, the knocking repeating. No phone, no way to call for help. Just me alone. The knocking stopped. The silence stretched on. After a few minutes, I got up slowly and moved to the window near the door. I shined the flashlight outside, focusing on the spot where the knocks came from. The beam caught something lying against the wall, a long, thin stick or maybe a branch. It looked out of place, like it had been placed there deliberately. I didn't touch it. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The night passed with no more noises, but sleep was impossible. Every creak and snap outside made me jump. I stayed awake by the fire, watching the windows, clutching a kitchen knife I had brought just in case. Morning light was a relief. The sun filtered weakly through the clouds, brightening the cabin and chasing away the heavy darkness. I stepped outside to look around. The clearing showed no sign of footprints or tracks near the cabin. No evidence of anyone nearby. The stick from last night was gone. But the ground was soft and wet from recent rain, so any tracks could have been erased. I decided to hike a bit further, to clear my mind and get away from the cabin for a while. The forest was dense but beautiful in the daylight, with tall trees and thick underbrush. Birds sang, insects buzzed, and the air smelled of moss and damp earth. I felt safer out here, though a small part of me stayed alert, remembering the strange sounds from the night. After a couple of hours, I returned to the cabin. As I got closer, I noticed something on the ground near the front steps. A pile of small stones arranged in a neat circle. I hadn't put them there. They looked deliberate, like a marker or a sign. I felt a cold chill. Who had been here? Why? I searched the surrounding area but found nothing else unusual. No footprints, no trash, no signs of a campsite. That night was worse than the first. The knocking came again, but this time at different places around the cabin. Sometimes on the roof, sometimes on the windows, always slow and rhythmic. The scraping noises returned, louder and closer. I stayed inside, barricading the door with a heavy chair. The fire had almost died out, and I was too scared to leave it. I sat in a corner, knife in hand, eyes darting to every shadow. At one point, the cabin door rattled violently, as if someone was trying to force it open. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. The chair didn't budge. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. I waited for what felt like hours until the sun rose again. When morning came, I found deep scratches on the wooden door, long and jagged, as if claws or a sharp tool had scraped it. The lock was intact, but the marks were clear. I knew I couldn't stay another night. Whatever was out there, it was not just an animal. It was deliberate. I packed my things quickly, not daring to make noise. Before leaving, I took one last look around. Near the edge of the clearing, I saw fresh footprints in the mud, large, heavy prints that looked like boots, but much bigger than mine. They circled the cabin, disappearing back into the woods. I couldn't tell how many sets there were, but it was enough to know I wasn't alone out here. I locked the cabin as best I could and ran to my car down the dirt road. The engine struggled to start at first, but eventually it caught, and I sped away, not looking back. Even now, days later, I keep thinking about that cabin, about the noises, the knocks, the scratches, and those giant footprints. I never saw anyone or anything, but I know I wasn't alone in those woods. The silence and darkness there weren't peaceful. They were watching, waiting. I've stayed far from that place since, and I don't plan to go back. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I stayed one more night, but I'm glad I left when I did, before the knocks turned into something worse. The forest was quiet when I arrived at the cabin. It stood alone, deep in the woods, far from any other sign of life. The sky was overcast, thick gray clouds pressing down, blocking out the sun. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. I parked my car on the gravel driveway, the tires crunching under the weight, and grabbed my bags. I had planned this trip for weeks, a chance to get away from the noise of the city, to clear my head, and to spend a few days alone, disconnected from everything. The cabin was small but solid. Weathered wood, a stone chimney, and a porch with peeling paint that creaked underfoot. I stepped inside and was greeted by the smell of old wood and faint dust. The floorboards groaned beneath me, and the windows were grimy but still let in enough light to make out the furniture. A small table, 2 chairs, a rickety bookshelf filled with outdated novels, and a fireplace with some old half-burned logs. I unpacked slowly, placing my clothes in the small closet and setting my food and supplies on the counter. I had brought a camping stove, water, canned food, and a few tools: an axe, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a hunting knife. The electricity here was unreliable at best, and I wasn't sure there would be any cell signal. I was prepared for the silence, the isolation. As evening fell, the forest seemed to come alive with sound. The wind whispered through the trees, branches tapping gently against the windows. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted. I made a small fire in the fireplace, the flames crackling and casting flickering shadows across the walls. I sat close, feeling the heat seep into my skin, but there was a coldness outside that no fire could touch. Night deepened, and the noises in the woods grew louder. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs breaking underfoot. At first, I told myself it was just animals, deer or raccoons, maybe a fox. The forest was full of life after all. But then I heard something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I stopped breathing. The footsteps were too heavy for a small animal. They weren't random either. There was a rhythm to them, steady and measured. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my hands trembling. Peering out the window, I saw nothing but darkness. The trees swayed, shadows moving with the wind, but no shape, no figure. The steps stopped just beyond the tree line, silence pressing in so tight I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then came a low growl, deep and guttural, followed by the sound of something dragging across the dirt. I slammed the window shut and locked it, my breath coming in short gasps. I went to the porch and checked the locks on the door, making sure everything was secure. The cabin felt suddenly too small, like a fragile shell I was trapped inside. I sat back by the fire, gripping the axe tightly, eyes darting to the windows. Hours passed, the fire dying down to embers, and the forest fell quiet again. I convinced myself it was just a wild animal, maybe a bear or a large dog. I told myself it would move on. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the perimeter. The ground was soft and wet with dew. As I walked around the cabin, I found large footprints pressed deep into the dirt, much bigger than any animal I knew. They were spaced far apart, like whoever or whatever was walking there was tall and heavy. The prints led to the edge of the woods, then stopped. I felt a chill, despite the rising sun warming the air. There were scratch marks on the wooden walls of the porch, deep gouges that looked fresh. I traced them with my fingers, feeling the rough splinters. I spent the day gathering wood and keeping the fire going, trying not to think about the footprints or the growl. The forest was alive with noise, birds singing, insects buzzing, but the memory of the footsteps haunted me. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me freeze, heart pounding. That night was worse. The sounds returned, louder and closer. Something was circling the cabin, its heavy steps trampling the underbrush. I stayed up, sitting in the dark with the axe in my lap, waiting for dawn. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. I needed to leave, but the car was parked too far from the road, and the path back was overgrown and muddy. I decided to wait until morning. When dawn finally broke, I packed quickly and headed for the car. As I moved through the woods, I noticed more signs: broken branches, tufts of fur caught on thorns, and more deep footprints. They followed me. Halfway to the car, I heard a growl behind me. I spun around, flashlight ready, but saw only shadows between the trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I started running, branches whipping against my face, the muddy ground slick underfoot. Reaching the car, I slammed the door shut and locked it, heart hammering. I started the engine and sped away, not looking back. The forest swallowed the cabin behind me, dark and silent again. Later, I learned the area was known for a large, elusive bear, one that had been sighted but never caught. It had probably been following me, curious or territorial. The thought of that massive animal prowling so close to me in the dark, just outside the thin walls of the cabin, made my skin crawl. I was lucky. The bear didn't attack. It never tried to break in. But the memory of those heavy footsteps, the growl in the night, and the raw feeling of being hunted in the wilderness stayed with me. The cabin had seemed like a peaceful retreat, but in the wild, you are never truly alone. The forest is full of eyes watching, ears listening, and something always moving just beyond the light. I wouldn't go back there. Not alone, not ever. Sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is still, I can still hear the echoes of those footsteps, slow and steady, reminding me how small and fragile I really am out in the wild. I never thought a simple weekend getaway to a cabin in the woods would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The trip started like any other. I had found the cabin online, a small, rustic place tucked deep in the forest, away from any town or neighbors. The pictures made it look cozy: wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a small porch overlooking a clearing surrounded by tall trees. It was perfect for someone like me who wanted to escape the noise and stress of the city for a few days. I packed my bags, grabbed some food, water, and basic camping gear, and set off early on a Friday morning. The drive was long but peaceful. The road narrowed as I got closer to the cabin, eventually turning into a rough dirt path that rattled the car as I drove over stones and tree roots. The forest thickened around me, tall pines and oaks pressing in on both sides. When I finally arrived, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin sat. It was smaller than I expected, but sturdy looking. A thin chimney puffed out faint smoke, though I knew no one else was supposed to be there. I unloaded my things, feeling a strange mix of excitement and relief. I was alone, and that was exactly what I wanted. The air was cool and fresh, smelling of pine needles and earth. I locked the car and stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my boots. The cabin door was unlocked. No surprise, since the listing said it was kept open for guests. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small kitchen area, a table, 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace. To the side was a door leading to a tiny bedroom with a bed covered in a thick quilt. I unpacked, set my things down, and started a fire in the hearth. The crackling flames gave the room a warm glow. Outside, the forest was already darkening. I made myself a simple dinner, canned soup warmed over the fire, some bread and water. I ate slowly, enjoying the silence that filled the space. No city sounds, no people, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling, or the distant call of a bird or an animal. After dinner, I decided to take a quick walk around the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating trees and rocks. The night was cold, and the ground was damp with evening dew. As I walked, I noticed small tracks around the cabin, likely from raccoons or deer. Nothing unusual. I went a little further into the woods, just far enough to feel the thickness of the trees around me. The smell of wet leaves and moss was strong. I turned back after a few minutes, not wanting to be too far from shelter. Back inside, I sat by the fire and tried to read a book, but sleep was pulling at me. The quiet was almost too much. I finally put the book down and went to bed. The first night was restless. I woke a few times, hearing sounds outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. At one point, I thought I heard a low growl, but it was so faint I wasn't sure. I told myself it was just an animal passing by. The forest was full of them after all. Morning came, gray and overcast. I made coffee on the small stove and ate a quick breakfast. The peacefulness returned with the light. I planned to spend the day hiking on some nearby trails. The cabin had a map, and the owner had suggested a few routes. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my phone, though I wasn't expecting much signal. The path started behind the cabin, winding through dense trees. The air was cool and moist, and the ground soft underfoot. The hike was refreshing at first. Birds chirped in the branches, sunlight filtered through the leaves. I took my time, stopping occasionally to look at plants or rocks. But after about an hour, the trail narrowed, and the forest grew denser. The tall trees blocked more light, and the path became harder to follow. I checked the map, trying to make sure I was on the right track. Then I noticed something strange. The trail markers were missing or broken. Small piles of rocks that usually marked the way were scattered or knocked over. I shrugged it off, maybe animals or wind had disturbed them. I pressed on. After a while, the forest grew silent. No birds, no wind. It was heavy, like the air itself was thick. I stopped to catch my breath, noticing how tight the trees were packed. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks jutting out. My heart started to beat a little faster. I looked back to see the trail, but the way seemed different. The path behind me didn't look like the one I'd been following. I realized I had been walking in circles. I pulled out my phone to check GPS, but there was no signal. The map app wouldn't load. I was alone in the woods with no way to call for help. The feeling of being watched crept in. I scanned the trees, the shadows between trunks, looking for movement. Nothing, yet I had the strong sense that I wasn't alone. I decided to head back toward the cabin, marking landmarks as I went, but the forest all looked the same. After 30 minutes of walking, I came to a small clearing. In the center was a large tree, its bark scratched deeply in multiple places. The scratches looked recent, long, vertical marks, as if something with sharp claws had tried to climb or mark it. My stomach twisted. I looked around carefully. There were broken branches on the ground and crushed plants. Something large had been here. My mind raced through possibilities. Bears, mountain lions, or something worse. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I didn't want to panic. I kept walking, staying aware of every sound, every shadow. After another hour of careful navigation, I finally spotted the cabin through the trees. Relief flooded me. I hurried toward it, heart pounding. When I got back, the cabin looked the same, quiet and still. I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to calm myself with a warm drink. That night, I kept the fire burning and the door locked tight. Every small noise made me jump. I heard something scratching outside, close to the walls. Something heavy moving through the underbrush. I was sure it was a wild animal, maybe a bear. But bears usually avoid humans, especially when a fire is burning. Still, the sounds came closer, circling the cabin. I searched for anything I could use for defense. A heavy iron poker by the fire, a large knife in the kitchen. I kept them close. The sounds outside grew louder and more frequent as the night wore on. At one point, I heard a deep growl, low and threatening. My heart felt like it would burst from my chest. I stayed awake until dawn, never once leaving the fire. When the first light came, the sounds stopped. I dared to open the door a little and peek outside. The ground around the cabin was disturbed. Footprints, deep and wide, circled the porch. Large claw marks were on the wooden posts. I knew then that whatever had been out there was huge and powerful. I called the cabin owner as soon as I had a signal on my phone again. He said he had no idea what could have made those marks, but advised me to leave immediately. I packed my things quickly, still shaken but determined to get out. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror at the dark forest behind me. I never wanted to come back. The sky was a dull gray when I pulled off the main road and onto the rough dirt track leading to the cabin. The air was cold, even for early spring, and there was a dampness that clung to everything. The trees, the ground, the rocks lining the path. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A chance to get away from the city noise, the crowded streets, and endless deadlines. Just me, a small cabin deep in the woods, and a few days of silence. I'd found the place online, advertised as isolated and perfect for recharging, and it had seemed like the kind of escape I needed. The road ended at a small clearing where the cabin sat. It was older than I expected. Logs darkened by age, a roof patched here and there with metal sheets. The porch sagged a bit on one side, and weeds pushed through the cracks in the stone foundation. Still, it looked sturdy enough. I grabbed my bag and the box of supplies I'd packed, locking the car behind me and starting toward the front door. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and something faintly sour, like old dampness trapped beneath years of closed windows. The air was still, heavy with dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight filtering through grimy panes. I set down my bags and started to look around, taking it all in. The cabin was small but had what I needed. A small kitchen with a stove, a table, a tiny bathroom with a rusted sink, and a single bedroom in the back. A fireplace dominated one wall, surrounded by cracked stone and soot stains. The place had clearly been used a lot in the past, but not recently. That was fine. I liked a little roughness. It made the quiet feel more real. I set about lighting the stove to warm up some water and unpacking my supplies. I'd brought canned food, bottled water, some basic tools, and a small first aid kit. I wanted to keep things simple here. No distractions, just the woods and me. As the water heated, I moved to the window and looked out. Trees, thick and close, formed a nearly unbroken wall around the clearing. The forest floor was littered with dead leaves and broken branches. Every now and then, a bird or squirrel stirred somewhere among the limbs. The wind whispered softly through the pines, a steady, low moan that seemed to stretch on forever. It was peaceful but carried a strange weight, like the forest itself was watching. That night, I ate a simple meal and settled in early. The wood stove sputtered and popped, sending faint sparks into the air as it warmed the room. Outside, the wind grew stronger, rattling the windows and shaking the old cabin like a breath on fragile bones. I lay awake for a while, listening to the creaks and groans of the old structure settling. But eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted off into a deep, dreamless sleep. I woke sometime in the early morning to an odd sound, soft, irregular thumps outside. At first, I thought it might be the wind knocking loose branches, but the pattern was too deliberate. I pulled back the curtain a little and peered into the darkness beyond the window. The clearing was barely visible in the moonlight, but I caught a glimpse of movement near the tree line, a large shape shifting quietly from shadow to shadow. I froze, heart hammering. The shape was too big to be a deer or any normal forest animal I'd seen before. It didn't move like a bear either. It seemed to glide along the edge of the trees, slow and cautious, as if it was watching the cabin, waiting. For what, I couldn't guess. I stayed behind the curtain, holding my breath as the figure disappeared from view. For the rest of the night, I stayed awake, eyes scanning every shadow. The wind outside died down, but the cabin still creaked as if something inside was stretching or shifting, trying to settle. By morning, the sun was already high, and the forest looked less threatening in daylight. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to take a walk around the clearing to clear my head and maybe spot whatever had been lurking outside. I stepped out onto the porch, the wood damp underfoot, and felt the cold air hit me like a wave. The forest stretched out in every direction, thick and unbroken except for this small patch of open ground. I walked slowly, my boots crunching leaves and twigs beneath me, eyes scanning for any sign of tracks or disturbance. Near the edge of the clearing, the underbrush was trampled in several places. Branches were snapped low, and the ground was churned up in a way that suggested a large animal had been moving through. But the prints were strange. Too wide, with no clear toe marks, just large, rounded impressions that didn't match any animal I knew. I crouched down to examine them, feeling a growing chill. The tracks circled the clearing, coming close to the cabin but never crossing the open space entirely. Whoever or whatever had made them was careful, moving just out of reach, watching. I returned to the cabin with a sense of unease settling deeper into my chest. Inside, I double-checked the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked tight. The cabin's old wooden locks weren't much, but they were something. The day passed in a fog of tension. Every noise seemed louder: the creak of the floorboards, the tapping of rain against the roof, the rustle of branches scraping against the cabin walls. I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see that large shadow again. But the forest was empty, silent except for the wind. That night, I tried to keep the fire going in the stove and stayed close to the small pile of supplies. The darkness pressed against the windows, heavy and thick. I didn't hear the thumping sounds from before, but I caught other noises, low guttural growls that rolled through the trees, far off but growing nearer. It wasn't the howl of a coyote or the cry of a wolf. It was something heavier, deeper, and more controlled. I sat frozen, gripping a small hatchet I'd brought for firewood. The growling stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then the pounding started again, sharp, rhythmic thuds against the outer wall of the cabin. My breath hitched as I leaned closer to the window, straining to see anything outside. A large, dark shape slammed against the side of the cabin, leaving deep scratches in the wood. The force was enough to shake the old structure. Then it retreated into the shadows. My heart raced. The reality hit me hard. This wasn't just an animal looking for food or shelter. This was something different, something aggressive and dangerous, and it was focused on the cabin. I spent the rest of the night barricaded in the bedroom, using a heavy wooden chair to block the door and clutching the hatchet tightly. The pounding and scratching continued sporadically, never lasting long but always enough to remind me it was there, waiting. Morning finally broke, and the sounds faded with the first light. I crept to the window and looked out. The clearing was a mess. The ground was dug up in places, branches broken and strewn around, and long, deep gouges scored the side of the cabin. The scratches looked like claw marks, wide, deep, and uneven. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had no signal, no way to call for help. The car was down the track, but it was almost a mile away, and I couldn't risk running through the woods alone with whatever was out there. I searched the cabin for anything I could use to defend myself better. I found an old hunting rifle hidden behind a loose board in the wall. It was rusty but seemed functional. I loaded it with the few bullets I had, trying to steady my shaking hands. The day was tense. I stayed inside, keeping every window covered and the doors locked. I barely ate, barely moved. The cabin felt like a cage, and the forest outside a prison filled with an unseen predator. By the second night, I was exhausted and barely holding on to hope. The noises outside had returned, louder and more persistent. The pounding turned into heavy stomps, the growls into sharp snarls. I could hear branches snapping as something large moved around the clearing, circling the cabin. I stayed awake, eyes wide, finger on the trigger of the rifle. Then, suddenly, the front door shook violently as if something huge was trying to break it down. The door frame groaned under the impact, and I fired a shot through the cracked window beside it. There was a terrible screech, a guttural cry, and then silence. I waited for hours, heart pounding, breath ragged. When dawn finally came, I cautiously opened the door to look outside. The clearing was empty. The marks on the door were deep and jagged, but there was no sign of the creature. Tracks led away from the cabin, deep and wide, disappearing into the thick forest. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin door as best as I could, and ran down the dirt road toward my car. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every shadow seemed alive with menace. When I finally reached the car, I was shaking so hard I could barely start the engine. The forest behind me was silent again, but I didn't look back. I drove straight to the nearest town, not stopping until I was surrounded by lights and people. The experience stayed with me for weeks after. I looked up local wildlife and consulted experts. There was no record of any animal matching what I saw. No bear, no mountain lion, no known predator that could make those sounds or leave tracks. I had planned this trip for months. The idea of a quiet weekend alone in a remote cabin in the woods had been a constant in my mind, an escape from the endless noise of the city and the stress of everyday life. I wanted to be away from everything, without phones, internet, or people. Just me, the forest, and silence. I thought it would be peaceful. I thought I'd come back refreshed. The cabin was in a deep forest about 3 hours from the nearest town. It was an old cabin, built decades ago, made from thick logs and rough timber. When I arrived just before sunset, the first thing I noticed was how utterly still everything was. No birds singing, no wind rustling the leaves, just the heavy, thick silence of the woods. I parked my car by the small dirt path leading to the cabin and stepped out. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. The sun was low behind the trees, casting long shadows. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight, locking the car behind me. The path to the cabin was narrow and overgrown in places. Small branches brushed my legs as I walked. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. The cabin looked exactly as the photos had promised. Small but sturdy. The windows were dusty and dark, the door heavy with iron hinges. I unlocked it with the key I found hidden in the fake rock under the porch, an old trick the owner told me about before I came. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood and mold. The floorboards creaked under my feet. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. No power. I wasn't surprised. The owner said there was no electricity, and I had brought a lantern and candles. I set down my pack and went to the small fireplace. It was stone-built and looked like it hadn't been used in years. I had brought firewood with me, along with matches and kindling. I knew I needed to get a fire going quickly before it got too cold. The cabin was old and drafty. The wooden walls and floor were thin in places. Outside, the sun dipped further, and the forest darkened. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air and stretch my legs. The trees stood tall and motionless. I heard the faint sound of a stream nearby. The peacefulness was almost unnatural. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed absent. I decided to explore around the cabin. Just a small walk down the path, maybe 100 meters or so. The forest was dense, filled with tall pines, birch trees, and thick underbrush. The ground was uneven, with roots twisting out of the soil. I could feel my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The air was cooler here, and the shadows grew longer. As I walked, I noticed broken branches on the ground and marks in the dirt. Some looked like claw marks or scrapes made by an animal. I thought maybe a deer or a bear had passed through recently. The thought made me uneasy, but I pushed it aside. I wasn't here to be afraid, I reminded myself. After a while, I returned to the cabin and started preparing a simple dinner. I boiled water on the old camping stove I brought. I had packed canned food, bread, and some cheese. The stove worked fine, and soon I had a warm meal. I ate slowly, watching the shadows move outside the small windows. As darkness settled fully, the forest outside became a black wall. I lit candles around the cabin and sat by the fireplace. The fire finally caught, crackling and sending warm orange light dancing across the walls. The flames cast flickering shadows on the rough wood, and the silence in the cabin was deep, almost pressing. I tried to read a book, but my eyes kept wandering to the windows. Then I heard it, a soft, low growl from somewhere outside. It wasn't loud, but clear enough to make my skin crawl. The hairs on my neck stood up. It came again, longer this time, mixed with the sound of twigs snapping nearby. I froze. The growl wasn't a wolf or coyote sound I recognized. It was deeper, rougher, something large, heavy, moving quietly. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly moved to the door. Peeking outside, the beam cut through the darkness. The trees looked like dark shapes, and the forest floor was barely visible. I scanned carefully. No movement. Then a heavy breath, close by, made me step back. The growl came once more, closer. I locked the door and pulled the curtains. My heart pounded hard, and I sat down with my back against the door, clutching a heavy wooden stick I found near the porch. The fire in the fireplace warmed the room, but the fear chilled my insides. The sounds came and went for hours. Scratches on the wooden walls, heavy footsteps around the cabin, growls that echoed through the night. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that wild animals could be curious and maybe even scared of me. But the sounds felt deliberate, like something was waiting, watching, testing me. Couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump. The fire burned low, and the cabin grew colder. Outside, the wind finally started to blow, moaning softly through the trees. The silence was broken, but it didn't make me feel safer. Around 3 a.m., the noises stopped. No footsteps, no growls, no scratching, just the wind and the occasional crack of a branch breaking. I stayed awake until dawn, eyes wide, heart racing. When the first light filtered through the trees, I stepped outside cautiously. The forest was quiet again, but the ground told a story. Huge paw prints circled the cabin, digging into the dirt and moss. Claw marks scored the wooden walls and the porch. Some of the marks looked fresh, very fresh. I packed quickly, not wanting to wait any longer. I grabbed my gear and flashlight and made my way back down the narrow path to my car. The forest felt heavier now, darker. The weight of whatever had been outside last night pressed on me. As I reached my car and locked the doors behind me, I took one last look back at the cabin. The tall trees stood silent, hiding their secrets well. I didn't look back again. Driving away, I felt relief mixed with dread. I had faced something real and dangerous. Not ghosts or stories, but the raw power of nature and the unknown animals that live beyond the edge of human comfort. The forest was beautiful, but it was wild, and not everything in it wanted to be found. The air was already thick with the smell of pine and damp earth when I arrived at the cabin. It sat back from the narrow dirt road, surrounded by a tight circle of tall, silent trees whose thick trunks blocked much of the fading daylight. The sun was sinking low, its last light threading through the branches in weak, golden fingers that barely warmed the cool forest floor. The ground beneath my boots was soft and uneven, scattered with pine needles and dry leaves that crunched lightly as I walked toward the cabin door. This was the kind of place people dreamed about, quiet, isolated, away from the noise and madness of the city. I had found the cabin online, a small rental tucked deep in the woods, promising solitude and a chance to disconnect. I needed that, No calls, no emails, no buzzing phones. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the crackle of a fire. The cabin itself was small but solid. Weathered wood with dark stains, its roof covered in moss and small branches fallen from nearby trees. The front porch sagged slightly under years of neglect, the wood groaning as I stepped on it. I unlocked the door with a key I had picked up earlier that day in town and pushed inside. The interior smelled of old wood and dust. The cabin was sparsely furnished. Just a small kitchen with a propane stove, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed pushed into the corner, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A few blankets were folded on the bed, and there was a lantern hanging from a hook on the wall. No electricity, no running water, no phone signal. Exactly what I wanted. I set my backpack down, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and started unpacking the few things I had brought. A flashlight, some canned food, bottled water, a first aid kit, and a stack of firewood I'd collected nearby. I planned to spend the night here, then head back the next day. The forest outside was already darkening fast. The wind had picked up, stirring the pine needles and making the branches sway and creak like old bones. I built a small fire in the fireplace, the dry wood catching quickly and throwing warm orange light across the cabin's rough walls. Outside, the sounds of the forest were changing as night settled in. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, the crack of a twig somewhere beyond the trees. I ate a simple dinner, beans heated over the stove and some bread, and then sat close to the fire, letting the warmth spread through my cold fingers. The cabin felt peaceful, almost comforting. But as the night deepened, the silence started to feel heavier. The usual sounds of the forest began to fade, replaced by a strange, low hum in the air that I couldn't place. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or some animal moving far off. But then I heard it, something heavier than a squirrel, too big to be a fox. It was moving slowly, something large scraping against the trees just beyond the clearing where the cabin sat. My heart quickened. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a wall. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, swinging left to right, but I saw nothing but the black shapes of the trees. The sound had stopped. I stayed out there for a long time, listening, but the forest was silent except for the wind. When I went back inside, I double-checked the door and windows, making sure they were locked tight. I sat by the fire again, the orange glow casting long shadows across the walls. The hum was back, low and steady, almost like the sound of heavy breathing, but not human. Hours passed. I kept my eyes on the windows, flashlight ready. The fire died down to embers, and cold seeped back into the cabin. At some point, the humming stopped, and the silence returned. But just as I was starting to relax, a sharp noise came from the porch outside. A heavy thud, like something large hitting the wood. I froze. The door was locked. No way in, but the sound was close and real. I waited, breath held, for more noise. Nothing. Then the scratching started, a slow, dragging scrape along the wood floor of the porch. My mind raced through what it could be. A bear? A deer caught in a trap? Person? I didn't want to believe it was a person. No phone signal, miles from the nearest road. But the thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. I grabbed my pocket knife and the flashlight, ready to defend myself if needed. The noise stopped. The forest returned to silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring out the window, waiting for the first light. When dawn finally came, it was pale and weak, filtering through the mist that clung low to the ground. I stepped outside cautiously. The porch was scratched up badly, deep gouges in the wood that looked like claws. There were broken branches and disturbed leaves all around, leading into the thick trees. I followed the tracks left behind, careful not to step too loudly. The prints were huge, bigger than any dog or wolf I'd seen before. The claws were sharp and long. The tracks led deeper into the forest, but I stopped at the edge of a small clearing and looked around. I found a patch of disturbed dirt where something heavy had dug. There was a smell, faint but unmistakable, rotting meat mixed with wet earth. I realized then what I was dealing with. Not some friendly forest creature, but a large, wild predator. Probably a bear. The claw marks and size fit, but the way it moved, the slow, patient scraping at the cabin, it was no accident. It was testing me, trying to get in. For the rest of the day, I stayed close to the cabin, keeping a fire burning outside and using every bit of common sense I could to keep safe. I made sure to bring all food inside and put it as far away from the cabin as possible, hoping to keep the animal's interest away from me. That night was worse. The creature came back more confident this time. The sounds were louder, heavier. It slammed into the porch, scratched the walls, even broke a window pane. I hid inside, clutching my knife, too scared to sleep. I had no way to call for help. No signal, no neighbors, just me and the animal trapped in this small cabin miles from anywhere. I knew I couldn't stay. At first light, I packed as quickly and quietly as I could, carrying everything inside my backpack. The fire was cold ashes. The porch was a wreck, the wood splintered and gouged deeply. I waited until the first weak sun rays lit the forest. Then I slipped out the back door, moving fast but carefully through the underbrush. The tracks from the animal were fresh, but it hadn't followed me yet. The walk back to the road was long and exhausting. Every step felt like a risk. The woods were alive with sounds, birds, rustling, and somewhere, the faint echo of heavy footsteps. I didn't stop until I saw the road and then the first car passing by. When I finally reached town, I went straight to the ranger station and reported everything. The rangers took me seriously. They knew the area was home to a large bear population, but nothing had been reported like this before. Such aggressive behavior so close to a cabin. They told me to never go back alone, to carry bear spray, and to always make noise when moving through the forest. It was clear this bear had lost its natural fear of humans, probably because of people feeding it or leaving trash behind. I never went back to that cabin. The memory of those nights, the cold, the sounds, the feeling of being hunted, stayed with me. The forest is beautiful, but it's wild. It doesn't belong to us. I learned that sometimes nature pushes back in ways you don't expect. Not ghosts or monsters, but real animals with real power and instincts. And when you're alone, far from help, that's more than enough to scare you.